They thought their legacy was safe. They thought they had secured their billions. But minutes before the old man died, a single, silent act of betrayal, carried out by the quietest person in the room, changed the entire game. And now, the reading of the will begins. The air in the mahogany-paneled study was thick with tension and the scent of old money. Every sterling relative, the arrogant nephew, the resentful ex-wife, the calculating cousins, sat waiting, their eyes fixed on the thick, sealed will. $20 billion was on the line, and they were ready to carve up the empire. They barely registered Elara, the timid maid, standing silently by the antique cabinet. She was just a ghost in the background. The lawyer's voice cut through the silence, reaching the final, crucial clause. They waited for a name like Marcus or Olivia, but their faces went cold, transforming from greed to confusion. They expected their billions. They just didn't realize the one person who deserved it most was standing right beside the hors d'oeuvres. The stage for this extraordinary reversal was the Sterling Manor, a fortress of glass and steel overlooking the city, the kind of house where even the shadows felt expensive. This was the domain of the late Arthur Sterling, a tech mogul who amassed $20 billion but lived a life defined by extreme solitude. His massive wealth had driven everyone away, or at least anyone genuine. He had the best security, the finest art, but his only companion was the quiet rhythm of the house staff. Arthur was not cruel, just attached, except for the one person who never asked him for anything. That person was Elara. For 2 years, Elara navigated the marble floors and gilded hallways, her presence as fleeting and unnoticed as the dust she cleared. Her job was perpetual, quiet motion. She wore the drab, neutral uniform, kept her head down, and moved like a shadow. To the family, she was background noise, easily confused with the other staff, the essential, yet utterly disregarded, machinery of the Sterling Empire. This invisibility, they would soon learn, was her greatest weapon. Leading the pack of circling vultures was Marcus Sterling, Arthur's only living nephew. Marcus didn't just ignore Elara, he actively abused his perceived authority after Arthur's passing. He would leave $50,000 watches on countertops, demanding she fetch him customized lattes, or cruelly remind her how quickly she'd be out of a job once he took over. He saw her exhaustion not as dedication, but as weakness. Marcus genuinely believed that Elara was just a nameless cog, setting the perfect stage for the moment when that cog would seize the entire machine. He was too focused on the money to ever notice the humanity. Arthur Sterling's massive wealth afforded him everything except 2 things: sleep and sincerity. This is how the impossible connection began, in the quiet hours between midnight and dawn. The family assumed Elara was in the house for the floors. In reality, she was the accidental therapist the billionaire was starving for. Arthur suffered from crippling insomnia, often retreating to his enormous, custom-built library. Elara's cleaning schedule dictated she would quietly polish the antique furniture there around 3 a.m. One night he spoke, not a command, but a philosophical question about a tattered copy of Marcus Aurelius he was holding. Elara, surprisingly, knew the context. She'd read it years ago. Their conversations evolved from that moment. They never spoke of money, stock, or mergers. They spoke of regret, the terrible price of solitude, and what truly mattered in the final years of life. Arthur confessed things to Elara he'd never admitted to any therapist or relative. He felt safe because Elara was utterly outside his world of deceit. She offered a simple, truthful perspective, untainted by the parasitic nature of the Sterling name. Arthur needed to know if her kindness was genuine, a fear that haunted the ultra-rich. He began testing her. Once, he forgot a diamond earring worth $250,000 on a dusty shelf. Elara simply logged it meticulously and secured it. Another time, he offered her a signed blank check for a job well done. Elara refused, instead pointing out a rare, first-edition novel he had mentioned wanting to read, asking only for time off to visit a sick relative. Her requests were always based on genuine need, never on acquisition. This was the pivotal difference. Arthur realized that while Marcus and the others saw his wealth as a tool for leverage and control, Elara saw him as just another lonely man. He finally understood the betrayal he'd suffered for decades. His family didn't love him, they loved the checkbook. Elara, the ghost in the maid's uniform, was the only person who saw Arthur Sterling, the person. As Arthur's health began to decline rapidly, the game of secrecy became urgent. He knew the will, if simply read, would be instantly contested. It needed a final, irrefutable anchor, a secret weapon. In a scene visually defined by shadows and urgency, just 48 hours before his death, Arthur summoned Elara to his bedside. He was pale, but his eyes were sharp. He handed her a small, tarnished object, an antique brass key threaded onto a worn leather cord. His voice was a low rasp. "Elara, this is the key to everything. You must keep it hidden until the very end. If they see it, they win. They will treat you like the maid until the last moment, and that is exactly what we need." Elara, shaking but resolute, promised him she would protect his final wish. The betrayal had been silently plotted, not against Arthur, but against his greedy, deserving family. The end came suddenly for Arthur Sterling. He passed in his sleep, alone, just 48 hours after entrusting his greatest secret to Elara. The moment the news broke, the Sterling Manor was no longer a home. It became a crime scene of avarice. The relatives descended like vultures, their grief manufactured, their conversations immediately turning to probate lawyers and asset liquidation. Marcus, the designated heir in his own mind, took immediate control. He began issuing commands, not condolences. He ordered the security team to lock down Arthur's files, and in a breathtaking display of callousness, he formally dismissed Elara and the other core staff. "You are redundant now," Marcus had sneered, tossing a meager severance check at her. "The property needs professional management, not housekeeping. Be grateful you're allowed to stay until the reading. We need you to clear out the pantry after the guests leave." His treatment of her was less about cost savings and more about establishing absolute, personal dominance. Elara simply nodded, her eyes downcast, the small, antique brass key secured under her uniform burning against her skin. Marcus was drunk on his own certainty. He and the others spent the day prior to the will reading engaged in petty squabbles over which abstract sculpture or vintage wine cellar they would claim first. They had been assured by their own high-priced lawyers that the will was simple, drafted years ago, heavily favoring Marcus as the only suitable successor. They celebrated their victory prematurely, unaware that the terms of the final betrayal had already been dictated by a lonely old man and executed by the person they considered a nonentity. Elara watched their frenzy from the peripheral corners of the manor, counting down the hours until the gavel fell and the invisible maid became the unavoidable owner. The tension in the study was a suffocating blanket. The lawyer, Mr. Hayes, adjusted his glasses, aware he held the power to shatter futures with every syllable. Every eye, save Elara's, was glued to the document. Marcus, slouched arrogantly in his chair, wore the complacent smirk of a winner who already knew the score. He just wanted the legal formalities done, so the real fun, the spending, could begin. Mr. Hayes began by dispensing small charitable bequests and small sums to distant, forgotten cousins. The amounts were negligible in the grand scheme, but they served to confirm Marcus's belief that he was the primary focus. To the Foundation for Abandoned Dogs, $2 million. To Miss Penelope Cruz, distant relative, $50,000. Marcus rolled his eyes, shooting a contemptuous glance toward Elara, who was tracing a pattern on the wooden floor with the toe of her shoe. He leaned over to his lawyer and whispered, loud enough for Elara to hear, "He's just getting the loose change out of the way. When do we get to the real numbers?" Then, the lawyer named a slightly larger figure. "To Marcus Sterling, nephew, for immediate financial security, and as a gesture of family loyalty, a payment of $10 million and the deed to the Aspen ski chalet. The relatives shifted. Marcus smiled, a triumphant flash of teeth. $10 million was a pittance, but it confirmed his favored position. He straightened his tie. See, I told you. Now, let's get to the Sterling Tech shares. The lawyer ignored the interruption and continued. He read a clause granting the deceased's ex-wife, who was present, a very modest yearly annuity, ensuring she had no basis for a contest. She erupted in a quiet, furious protest, swiftly silenced by her own attorney. The room fell deadly silent. This was it. Everything that followed would divide the $20 billion fortune and the controlling stake in Sterling Tech. Mr. Hayes cleared his throat again. Arthur Sterling dedicated the majority of his life to building a legacy of genuine utility, only to find that utility was all that mattered to those closest to him. Therefore, in an effort to restore true humanity and responsibility to his holdings, and to ensure his life's work continues under a guiding hand defined by integrity, he enacted a codicil 2 days before his passing. This codicil supersedes all previous directives and requires immediate execution. Marcus went rigid, his smirk dissolving into disbelief. Codicil? 2 days before. This wasn't part of his plan. He started to rise. Excuse me, Mr. Hayes, that document is surely... Silence, Mr. Sterling. The document is signed, notarized, and entirely valid. The will now grants the entirety of the remaining estate, including full controlling interest in Sterling Tech, the Manhattan penthouse, the yacht, the private island, and the whole of the $20 billion residual trust, to the following individual. The silence was crushing. You could hear the distant traffic outside the reinforced windows. The air was draining from Marcus's chest. The lawyer looked up, scanning the room, past the ex-wife, past Marcus, past the greedy cousins, until his gaze finally settled on the figure shrinking against the wall. To Elara Santos, who, during his last 2 years of life, was the only person who treated Arthur Sterling not as a bank, but as a man. The sound that followed was not a scream, but a collective gasp, followed by the chair-scraping clamor of Marcus jumping to his feet, eyes wide with pure, incandescent rage. Elara looked up, her quiet face finally showing a flicker of inner resolve. The maid was no longer invisible. She was the unavoidable owner. The study erupted. Marcus Sterling's rage was blinding. He launched himself toward the lawyer, screaming that the codicil was illegal, forged, and the delusion of a sick old man. His personal attorney promised a crippling legal battle that would drag Elara's reputation through the mud. Marcus looked at Elara, not as a rival, but still as the incompetent maid who dared to touch his inheritance. He genuinely believed she had no counterplay. Elara, however, did not flinch. Her hands, worn from 2 years of labor, moved slowly to the collar of her faded uniform. She unclasped the thin leather cord, pulling free the small, tarnished antique brass key Arthur had given her. She placed the key on the mahogany table with quiet finality. Mr. Hayes, the estate lawyer, nodded solemnly. He then revealed that this key was the final anchor. It unlocked a safe deposit box containing irrefutable video evidence of Arthur signing the codicil, explicitly stating that the key's revelation confirmed his intent and silenced any challenges. Marcus's legal options vanished, replaced by sheer, stomach-turning dread. Elara looked directly at Marcus for the first time, not with victory, but with profound disappointment. Her voice was soft, but it cut through the silence like a scalpel. "You were right, Marcus. I was cleaning up messes here." She paused, picking up her worn personal apron. "But now the ultimate mess is yours." She turned, leaving the $20 billion in the room, walking away from the screaming, defeated relatives. She didn't need the validation of a signing ceremony. The maid became the mogul, but the only thing she kept was her dignity. Arthur Sterling's final act of betrayal proved that the greatest inheritance isn't measured in billions, but in the kindness that money could never buy.